Welcome back to season 4 of Ascension Medical Educators, the facilitated session. I'm joined with my co-host and expert facilitator and personal mentor, Dr. David Leon Taylor.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. Glad, of course, to see all of our scholars back for another season of facilitated sessions.
Yes. And I'm your co-host and moderator, Dr. Darren Wayne Jackson II. And as I said, this is season 4, Dr. Taylor, or DT. I'm just going to call you DT. We're not going to do too formal.
That's right.
So this is season 4, right? Season 3, we did our primer for medical school. So basically from your preclinical years up into step 1, right? So season 4, you want to know what the theme is?
Help me out. Let's hear it.
So the theme for season 4 is the medical school closer. So what we're going to do here is tap in on this first episode, which is called The Beast, USMLE Step 1. And the theme for today is the mindset, the blueprint, and the science of learning. So we've been doing a pretty good job setting a framework of how we break things down in terms of our approach to studying and our approach to overall being a, medical trainee. And so we usually start off with the mental health and wellness framework.
Very important foundation.
Very important. Then we go into the blueprint, right? And then we also tackle the mastery, right? So the mastery is then looking at the science of actual learning, right? So in this first segment, I want to talk about the mindset. Now, we frame everything and we start with wellness. And we did have a pretty healthy conversation about wellness as it pertains to the MCAT. And the good thing about wellness is that if you lock it in good enough, it doesn't have to change, right?
That's key.
That's key, is to have a disciplined system that can really be malleable to all different types of circumstances that you're in. But there are some key differences between the MCAT and the step 1, right?
Absolutely.
We're going to start at step 1. We're going to get into step 3 as step 2 as well. But we're going to start at step 1. Now, just off general sense, can you, as the academic guru, medical educator that you are, give me some differences between the MCAT exam and step 1?
The medical college admissions test versus the United States medical licensure exam. Look at the names.
Yes.
One is one consideration for admission into medical school. So we move from pre-medical scholar to medical student scholar. The other now is focused on the first part of our licensure as an aspiring physician, because now you're a medical scholar and there are 3 components to your licensure. I want you, DJ, to also think about when you were preparing for the MCAT, did you have a consideration of, I have a lot of time to study for this, and if I need to take it more than once, that's okay.
So I see where you're getting at, and it's good that we're starting there, because this goes into the mindset, which is good to analyze and have a pretty good sense of what our mindset is, so this way we can set a proper framework. So I think where you're going at is, when I was preparing for the MCAT, you kind of had a feeling, you wanted to knock it out the park on the first try, but you had the feeling where as though if you had some, unfortunate incident where you had to retake the exam, you had a rolling opportunity to take the MCAT exam, obviously to the detriment, of, just having multiple attempts on your transcript. However, there was no real penalty, right? Now for step 1, both are high stakes, but whereas though the MCAT is, dictating where you go, the step 1 exam is dictating where you stay, because you're already going to be in medical school. So there's not an infinite amount of times. Just by the framework of your institution, there's usually a limit by the institution and from USMLE about how many times you can take the step 1 exam. But just in general, from a time standpoint and how the curriculum moves in medical school, you don't have an infinite amount of time to study for this exam. So that starts off the framework of what we need to be considering when thinking about our wellness framework and our wellness plan for approaching step 1 versus when we put our wellness plan together for MCAT.
Right.
Is
Let
that
me
where
just
you
give
was
you
going?
one other thought on that. And that's right, in that this MCAT,
Mm-hmm.
of course, is one consideration for gaining admission to medical school. And as you noted, you may take it more than once. That could affect your competitiveness for consideration, but that's still not as a significant penalty
Right.
as once you're in medical school, USMLE Step 1 is part of your licensure, and there are specific requirements for your licensure. There are limitations. And so we want the scholar to excel and be successful on the first attempt. A second and important difference also is that how we now challenge you in terms of the competency, your relative expertise in understanding your career path and demonstrating your knowledge and your thinking is different.
Mm-hmm.
With the MCAT, you may recall there was sort of an early exposure to some patient scenario, and you were using aspects of your general chemistry, physics, social sciences, like, psychology.
Mm-hmm.
But now, as a medical student, it's much more in depth,
A
right?
lot more integration.
And a lot more integration. That's the key. And we've now given you a solid foundation in the preclinical sciences. And now the questions have a more in-depth, what we call clinical vignette or paragraph of information, a lot more real world that you'll be encountering as a physician, and that requires advanced thinking. So two key differences there in terms of mindset, and that can impact how you want to consider your wellness plan to prepare for that, right?
Another key difference, and this has changed since I've been a medical student, which it always seems to work out that way, but step 1 is now pass fail.
Oh.
So that's something that can also get you trapped up in if you have this mentality, whereas though pass fail means I can kind of have this very indifferent approach to the systems that I know I need to have in order to be successful. System 1, wellness. System 2, that blueprint of the exam. And system 3, the actual dedication and discipline to master that information, to recall it at the drop of a dime when I need to, in that minute and 30-second time frame on the test. So we're bringing up these differences because as preparing for step 1, you typically will go into a dedicated period. So it's usually about 6 to 8 weeks where you would get a dedicated period to study for your step 1 exam. And now, which has also been changed since I've been a medical student, is that we have these things called comp exams now. Right.
That's correct.
Now, can you give us a little bit of a breakdown of these comp exams? Because man, if I had to, there's another aspect that's a little scary, because I was a scary test taker. I was a scary test taker. We'll go into a little bit more of my own personal journey. However, what is up with these comp exams?
So these comp exams, is what I like to refer to them, they're competency. They, of course, assess your expertise in the foundation we've laid now for the preclinical sciences that you'll use to problem solve in medicine. And these are commonly known as the Comprehensive Basic Science Exam, or CBSE. And these are actually retired USMLE Step 1 licensure questions that are made available to the schools to assess a student's readiness to take Step 1. And the school will determine what the competency score is. It's usually a percentage score between 65 to 70% correct. That doesn't sound very high, but it's very challenging to achieve, as you know, because these are very advanced, critical thinking, in-depth type of questions, right?
And not only are they advanced critical thinking, in-depth questions, but you are under a very limited time constraint.
That is correct.
So you can got on either one of those ends.
That is correct. And that's correct. And so now, in order to be eligible at many schools, U.S. medical schools, and even some of the international medical schools, in fact, all international medical schools require that the scholars meet a certain score, it varies by school, on the CBSE before they're eligible to even take the USMLE Step 1. So that's another requirement that's much different than when you were a pre-medical scholar with the MCAT. You could take it when you thought you were ready.
Right.
In medical school, you will now be required to demonstrate readiness by a competency exam in order to sit for Step 1. And that's becoming increasingly a requirement across all U.S. medical schools.
And that's interesting. I'm always going to speak from the standpoint, of the student.
Absolutely.
Because
gone through the journey.
Yeah. So it's that would have been additionally terrifying for me. And then, one has to think, is this a way that, schools kind of secure that high pass rate of the at USMLE? Do you feel like this is something that works to the benefit of the student, or something that's, that something that works to the benefit of the student, or something that's kind of more detrimental, like it adds a little bit more scare and terror that may not need to be there?
DJ, a very critical question. Here is the perspective that we want to always have. As an aspiring physician, you are being granted one of the most special privileges in life, which is the intimate association with one's health.
Yes.
That's a privilege. That privilege requires that we demonstrate a competency, not only in terms of trust and communication with the patient, but also clinical knowledge, reasoning, and skills. And so the schools are moving in this direction not to penalize students, but to encourage and remind the students that to have the privilege of practicing medicine, you have to be licensed. And so this tool, this competency assessment, is a way for you to gauge your readiness to actually be successful on your first attempt for Step 1. That's the perception and disposition we should have, because I want to be an outstanding physician. And yes, I am more than an exam. Every scholar is more than an exam. My accountability to be able to demonstrate my skills and my understanding is part of who I'm becoming as part of a physician. That's where we're going with it.
Yeah, I hear you, DT. On a good day, you might have some students take that perspective, but on a bad day, that's an extra hurdle, now that we have to do. But I
and watch this one. You make a very good point, because that's real, right? And one of the challenges is, and this is the part that we don't appreciate sometimes till later in our journey, and it becomes a little bit of a barrier. If I'm not able to actually receive that perception or disposition, this is part of my professional development. Embrace it. I want to be excellent in medicine, versus the system is trying to jam me up and prevent me from becoming a physician. Why do I have to do this? If I take that latter perspective, I will likely struggle, because embedded in that statement, if I reverse it, is I do not want to have the learner accountability, the professional accountability to ultimately reach that standard. That is not a good feeling to have. If I have areas of improvement, how about I seek those who will help me with the mastery? How about I seek those that help me with the mentorship, so I can be my best, reach or exceed that standard? Or I can make an excuse and say they're trying to jam me up, and now be impeding my journey because I haven't owned who I'm supposed to be becoming as a physician. That's real talk.
And so I like to play devil's advocate. Because I wanted to play devil's advocate with you for that one, because that starts off how we, start our framework with mindset, right? So we talked through season 1, season 2 about your professional identity and the things, that self-dialogue that you tell yourself. So if I'm taking these different hurdles, or looking at, you know, the exam benchmarks, because it's just there. You chose a profession that is going to be exam heavy, right? So with that being said, if I look at, you know, every opportunity that I have to demonstrate my mastery as a hurdle, as opposed to my ability to be able to demonstrate that I am a master learner of the material that you entrusted for me to learn. Because when I'm on the wards and I'm not, well, you know, I'm jumping ahead, but we're not M3s. Let's just even say we're AIs, you know, fourth year medicine rotation clerkship. You know, that patient's health, life is in your hands. And so we want to make sure that we have the best, you know, grasp, the best, you know, understanding of the material and how we have to apply it. That's how these vignettes are constructed.
That's right.
How we have to apply it so that this way we can, you know, be the best doctors that we can be.
That's
so starting with that mindset. Now, you know, we brought those things in because we're talking about the differences between the MCAT and, you know, step one. And, you know, just briefly, we can go back over some of the things, you know, go back to season 1, season 2, about some of those real keystone mental health and wellness toolkit things that we can do to keep ourselves grounded. Not
GPS.
just in yes, GPS. Not just in that you know, prep and dedicated period, because now you're having a dedicated period. But also day of, and then your post-exam experience, because for step 1, just similarly to the MCAT, you'll be waiting for, you know, at least a few weeks for that score. So, you know, we want our students to be calm, grounded in that time frame of waiting for this score, and know that they put their best foot forward and they got it, right?
Absolutely.
And there's always a plan if something deviated from that goal on day of, right? And so having that mindset for that 6 to 8 week period is going to be good. That this is 6 to 8 weeks for me to lock in. I have time aside from being in my curriculum. Sometimes students may even travel home if that's the best option, to go, you know, go to your parents' house or go somewhere where you feel like comfortable, or that you already have a system at. So this way you can lock in for those 6 weeks, 6 to 8 weeks. You demonstrate that by each day, applying it like it's a job. Practice it like it's a job.
That's right.
Because once you get into clerkships, that's how you'll speak about it, right? And so practice going at it every day like it's a job. You know, I have my ritual, morning time, gym meditation. I would be at the TV just in time to see Skip Bayless and Shannon Sharp. And then, you know, at 8 a.m. sharp, I was doing my practice blocks. And this was every day throughout the day. Then at some point, you know, you had your first aid review. And then you had your dedicated wellness in the afternoon. And evening time, you know, maybe some light, you know, review during the evening time. But having that system going in, then having those calming and grounding, you know, techniques during the day of, and of course, kind of using those same techniques that you did going into the exam to keep yourself grounded, will get you through that last phase of those 3 weeks or 4 weeks when you're waiting on that Wednesday, between 10 a.m. and 12 p.m. noon, to get that score. So, you know, I just think that that's a good place to start. So I think now we could kind of move into our second segment, which is going into that blueprint, knowing, and I have this called knowing thine enemy. Knowing thy enemy, right? Because it's not really an enemy, right?
That's right.
But if you have that framing, it can catch you up. So with the blueprint, and this is something that we don't, you know, a lot of students don't take a lot of time like really looking into what the blueprint is. So give us a little bit of information about the structure of the step 1 of the USMLE Step 1 exam.
And I just want to piggyback on one piece that you said before we get into the structure, is that everything that you described during that 6 to 8 week period, we commonly call that the dedicated. You hear this, the dedicated. The dedicated what? That is the dedicated step 1 study period, where you are in essence combining your wellness and your learning strategies in a focused time frame to get ready for step 1. Now, this dedicated period requires you to understand the blueprint, which is the structure of this exam, which in a nutshell is saying, are you able to take all the information that you have mastered, language that you've mastered in the what we call the basic sciences or the preclinical years of medical education across all the different systems of the human body? Are you able to take that information, and if we give you a clinical situation that kind of mimics what you might encounter with a patient, can you solve the problem? Can you tell us what went wrong with the normal biological, physiological processes, pathophysiology? What went wrong for the most part? That's about 80% of the exam. And then 20% of the exam is, can you just give me what we call a general diagnosis?
The popcorn.
The popcorn. For example, heart failure versus specific types of heart failure that you'll learn later on in your clinical years. And that'll be for a separate exam, the USMLE Step 2 CK, where your diagnoses become very specific and granular because there are many different types of heart failure. But on Step 1, can you just tell me it's heart failure? That's 20% of the time. But the other 80% of the time, can you tell us what went wrong that caused the heart to fail? So having that basic structure is going to be key because that will inform how you study during that dedicated period.
Right. So it sounds like we're moving more from a idea that this is, we're getting these single questions of like maybe general chemistry. That was like MCAT phase,
That was MCAT. That is correct.
So now with Step 1, we're getting these integrated and interdisciplinary nature of these questions, of these vignettes. So it blends all of these basic sciences together, the biochem, the gross anatomy, the histology, the embryology, but they're not discrete questions, so they're very integrated. And so it's not what is this, it's okay, now how does this work, or how do we work this up to figure out what caused this particular diagnosis?
That is correct.
Yeah,
that is correct. And a lot of times for the MCAT, one of my favorite exemplars is just to look at heart rate. And you remember for the MCAT, we have this sort of early exposure to kind of a clinical situation, and they may say, oh, there's a problem with this person's heart rate. And if there's a change in the heart rate and it's not normal, we call it an arrhythmia. And so you learned in general chemistry and in physics and in physiology, you bring all those principles together in some biochemistry, you can talk about membrane potentials. And that would ultimately get you to electrical rhythms, which can get you to a cardiac rhythm and arrhythmia. Okay, that was fine.
Right.
That's foundational for MCAT. Now you're in medical school. All of that is foundational. Now it's more advanced in biochemistry, advanced physiology, medical physiology, and pathophys. And now we can ask you a deeper dive question like, what type of arrhythmias? And without getting into the specifics of those type of arrhythmias, again, what was the pathophysiology, right? Because the detailed arrhythmias would come up on Step 2 CK. But it's much more integrated because you said, maybe there's a problem with the renal system.
Right.
And based on the problem with the renal system, it's impacting the heart.
Right.
And it's possible the heart could be impacted in many ways, one of which could be the electrical rhythm of the heart, because the kidney is also responsible for electrolyte homeostasis. Now we're getting deep, medical students.
Because now we're talking about electrolytes, we're talking about sodium, we're talking about potassium.
Yes.
And we do know there's many different of those cell types when we're talking about the contraction of the heart. All right. So we have sodium channel, we have the fast sodium channel, the funny channel, the funny sodium channel. Yeah,
that's right.
There's so many different channels. Calcium channel, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4. I remember it just like I'm
cardiac action potential.
Yes,
maybe some inspiring cardiologists who are getting excited about all this, right? That's right.
Yeah, so you get way more detailed, and even and you could correct me if this is more like a step 2 context, but when you're talking about medications, and how those particular medications, calcium channel blockers, beta blockers, and different medications that we use in the heart failure context. But as you said, we get more specific. What is this specific type of heart failure? Because if we have, or arrhythmia, or, some type of stenosis, because depending on what that pathology is, I may not use a beta blocker.
You just hit something that's very important on mastery. Watch this. So as we've been talking, there is a difference between step 1 and step 2 CK. We got step 2 CK coming up in the future episode. But one of the reasons why a lot of medical schools have begun to change their curriculum to help us understand integrative thinking is because of how all the information must come together.
Right.
From a step 1 perspective, when there is a cardiac arrhythmia, we can ask you all of the underlying pathophys related to, again, the electrolytes and the different channels and what could be happening there, right? And again, it can be integrated because the patient could be in renal failure that impacts electrolytes, and now the electrolytes that impact the heart and normal cardiac rhythm are impacted, we get a cardiac arrhythmia, okay? Now, on step 1, we just ask you the pathophysiology of that. Even if it's a medication on step 1, we do not ask you what medication do you use to treat it. We don't do that anymore, but we'll ask you, if there were a medication, what's the mechanism of action? That's applied biochemistry and pharmacokinetics. That's step 1.
Right.
Step 2 CK, for this same scenario, we could ask you the specific cardiac arrhythmia. Is it a type 1 block, type 2 block, etc.? And we could ask you the specific pharmacotherapy. That's the difference between your training in advanced clinical knowledge and reasoning and understanding. So when we master, as you said earlier, your preclinical sciences or basic sciences, you're not only going to succeed on step 1, but as you move on to the wards, and we now expect more of you, as we demonstrated in those questions, you can follow through.
So all of that just breakdown of how the pathophysiology works. It segues us into our third segment. In the third segment, we're talking about the science of learning.
Yes.
All right? What you described was a process for acquiring or the acquisition of information, the acquisition of learning for step 1. And with that, you have to have resources, right? So as a medical student, it was always, what is the best resource? Every student wants to know what the best resource is that's going to guarantee them a pass.
Guarantee.
Right?
Give me that one.
Yes, give me that one. And so I call it the golden ticket advice. Use UWorld, use Anki. You only need this deck on Anki, and you'll score a whatever. It's the highest score now. So let's start this segment off by playing a rapid fire game. Okay. What I'm going to do, I have a list of resources that we've all come in contact with as medical students, right? And we'll go into a little bit more later about how do we properly and appropriately select resources for our dedicated period. So right now I'm going to call out some resources, and you tell me if this resource is either for fact recall or advanced thinking.
All right.
Ready?
I'm ready.
All right. First aid.
Fact recall.
Boards and Beyond.
Advanced thinking.
Sketchy.
Advanced thinking.
Pathoma.
Advanced thinking.
Anki.
Fact recall.
And UWorld.
Both.
Okay. So, I know before in I believe season 3 we talked about spaced repetition, right? And we talked about how spaced repetition may not be the most optimal route for a particular learner. It has its place, but it may not be the best route for a learner. So we're talking about how to properly assess how we are as learners and what resources we should take on during this dedicated period, so this way we can have that success. So just give us a little bit of your pro tips about that approach when we are going into our dedicated period. Should we have already been using UWorld first year and second year, and now we're doing our second run through, the Q bank? Should we get the Q bank fresh? What should we focus on? Should we have one fact recall, one advanced thinking? So give us a little bit of pro tips on how we approach that.
We should start first with engaging our preclinical years with the goal of mastery learning. That's where it's always going to start, meaning that as I'm learning in my preclinical years, I'm really trying to understand information so I can then problem solve with it, not just try to memorize facts, because that's going to create a problem down the road, and it will challenge us with what learning resources we have to use later on when it's time to prepare. So if we go into the mindset that I am learning to understand, that's going to be your first major strategy. Now, what do we use to support that? Yes, there should always be at least one fact recall resource because you have to know basic information. But once you receive that basic information, you have to practice. What are the relationships? What does it mean? How will I use it to think about solving a problem? So a second resource that now incorporates thinking by how it's designed, both in terms of the information it presents, how it structures it, and then assesses you, that allows you to build that skill set. So you're going to use at least one of each. Now, once we get beyond that foundation of learning, this is where your academic advisor at your medical school is helpful, because he or she can see what are your learning preferences, because there are different types of fact recall resources and different types of advanced thinking resources, as you just shared, right?
Because
what was your experience with that?
I'm not an Anki guy. I'm
Exactly.
not an Anki guy. Everybody in my study group used Anki, and I found it very difficult personally to navigate through without spending too much time on each of the cards. So I tried to force myself, because the FOMO of everybody else is using Anki, everybody else is passing, I have to make it work for me. But after really, I don't care what deck it was, I couldn't get, I'm seeing my friends flying through the decks. I'm like, even if I could read that fast or just like process it that fast and just like, no, I'm good, let's go to the next one, I don't even know if I would even feel comfortable. It just wasn't for me. So and then also when you talk about the advanced thinking resource, right? And me and you had this conversation, and it was a game changer, because there was, I had always used UWorld, because that was just almost the standard resource that everybody said you had to have as a medical student. And during my, review, I went through the UWorld bank for a few times. Went through the UWorld bank, got through it about a time and a half. And then I switched over to another bank, started using Kaplan. And for some reason, I switched back over to UWorld. And then I just saw my scores just dropping precipitously. And I'm just like, there's no way, either this is maybe a reflection of burnout at this point, maybe I'm just tired of studying, but you gave me a good tidbit that really allowed me to understand a little bit more how I was as a learner, and how I was with picking that resource. So you talked to me about the differences between UWorld with how they structure some of their vignettes with distractors, right? And while for some learners that might be something, as a good exercise and technique for them to really master and lock down on those concepts, but for others it may be too much of a distractor. So if you have problems with timing, which was something that I struggled with all of my exams, that might jam you up. So I was scoring relatively well with using, the Kaplan and then also the Amboss. But then when I switched over to UWorld, it was just a drop. And so tell me a little bit more about, that, because, again, Anki, I figured other, fact recall, first aid was more suited for me. That was a better fit for me about how it was organized. I was able, with my advisor and then also my tutor, kind of section off UWorld to really be a good, fact recall resource for me. Excuse me. First aid, excuse me. I really was able to tap into first aid by the guidance of my tutor to really use it as a really strong fact recall resource. Now, for the UWorld versus Amboss or Kaplan, that's where I had to have a lot more advising with you, and you told me, gave me some good guidance. So just give the students a little bit of information about that.
So there's a lot of information that you just shared. And this is why it gets very complex, medical scholars, and it's important for you to begin to really understand what are your learning preferences and work closely with your academic advisor or medical education learning specialist on what resources are optimal for you. So I'm going to unpack it briefly. And that is, before we get to the question banks, commonly called Q banks, you listed, when we had the fun game, the different types of fact recall resources like First Aid, there's the Deja Vu series, there's the High Yield series, there's Anki. These are all fact recall resources. They all have the same facts. The organizational presentation to understand those facts are different. That's what I mean by learning preferences. So it's important to explore which ones are meaningful for you. And that can be done very simply by looking at the free sample of those type of resources electronically. They're always free samples so you can get a feel of it, right? Before you just take someone else's word. The same thing with the advanced resources like Pathoma and Boards and Beyond and Sketchy and Picturize. These all are organized different ways with different types of visuals, sometimes with mnemonics with visuals, sometimes with larger charts. It depends on how the person likes to take information in. It allows them, for those advanced thinking resources, to draw connections differently, not just see facts, but to see relationships. Because of the way they organize information, you can see and understand relationships. So again, the goal is, before you take anyone else's word for it, you have to take some time and just look at them. It only take 5 minutes to look at each one. And I say choose a topic that's difficult for you. Let's say renal failure is difficult for you. Look at a couple of fact resources and see what they do with renal failure. Renal failure is difficult for you. Look at a couple of advanced thinking resources, see which one is better for you. Now back to the Q banks. There's a big myth that one is better than the other.
Yeah,
right?
Because that was,
You heard that, right?
It was almost etched in stone,
right?
That you had to
You
have
had to do UWorld. You had to do UWorld.
Had do UWorld twice.
Right. I have no stock in UWorld or any of the other question banks. I have nothing against UWorld. But it does not matter whether it's Kaplan, UWorld, Exam Crackers, Pass Tests, Amboss. I can go on and on because I'm familiar with a lot of the different banks. That's my job as an expert learning specialist. All of the banks, USMLE RX, all of the question banks follow a publicly available blueprint from the United States Medical Licensure Exam. They follow the blueprint, meaning they organize the questions a certain way, right? They're a certain length, etc. So they all do that. They all give you these detailed explanations, okay? None of them, not one, has any evidence-based research that you can find in literature that says if you do our bank, we can show you by the data that you will pass step 1 or you will get this score in step 2 CK. Not one. Not one. That's all marketing. And students are very susceptible to marketing.
Oh, absolutely.
That's right. So what makes them different are these special features that they add on. Think about all of them following the same blueprint, but they have different features. You mentioned one for UWorld. UWorld tries to distinguish itself by adding a lot more what we call distractors or information that may be somewhat related to the question or not related at all. What that requires you to do is to have a testing behavior to know what's important. That's what they do.
Mm-hmm.
Kaplan says, you know what? You may want to work on how you develop your advanced thinking. So Kaplan has straightforward questions, moderate questions, and advanced thinking questions.
Mm-hmm.
And you can select it that way.
Mm-hmm.
So you can build your thinking that way.
Right.
In UWorld, it's all mixed in, but you have all these distractors.
Right.
Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Differences. So for one scholar, distractors might be the way to go to help them think better, to know what's important, and then to focus on that. For another, Kaplan's better, right? Because you said if there are too many distractors, it impacts your time.
Right.
Those extra features, like all those distractors, that's not on the actual step 1 exam.
Yeah, because you'll hear it, over and over again. The script is, yeah, but the real test is not as hard as UWorld.
Right. And more specifically, they'll say the vignettes on the real exam
are more straightforward.
Are not as long, which means that if a scholar has difficulty with timing or with going down what I call academic rabbit holes because there's so many distractors, then UWorld may not be an optimal bank for them because it doesn't represent as accurately from that one perspective of distractors. It has too many. It represents it well from the other aspects of general structure, the content, the explanations. Sure, it's great. But all the other banks are doing the same thing. They're good in that area too.
Right.
One more exemplar. AMBOSS. What distinguishes AMBOSS is they say, hey, you know how medical students like to highlight all the time, right? In yellow, what's important? Well, they have a special utility called highlight. And after you finish a question, you can hit the highlight button and it will highlight in yellow all of the key clues in the vignette, any key words in the question, and any key words in the answer, the correct answer. So it helps you see what should you have focused on.
Right.
Some scholars in their preparation have difficulty focusing on what's important in the vignette.
Right.
That particular Q bank may be better for that scholar because it helps them practice what's important.
And even from a standpoint of time, when you're doing error analysis, because like you said, you can go down a rabbit hole if you have longer vignettes, much more distractors. The explanations in UWorld are lengthy, right?
Yes.
And then they can also take you down a rabbit hole. So I've used UWorld, I've used Kaplan, I've used AMBOSS. And so when you're, you talked about that highlight feature with AMBOSS, it's clutch because when you do the review of your questions, the test block that you just did, each question, it starts off with a quick and just like high yield explanation. Then you can scroll up and then you look through the vignette and it has all of the high yield points that you should have taken into consideration. If temperature and the fact that this patient was febrile was important, that will be highlighted. If a particular lab or vital needs to be highlighted, it would be highlighted. So to make that association with like, I see these type of things and it's all culminating by the time I get to the end of this vignette. It's, a cholecystitis, right? And so then you can go to each individual selections and, figure out based on what, AMBOSS is giving an explanation of what's the most high yield things to know. And so, as you said, it really comes down to your preference. And that's the reason why, even having that blueprint time, to really hunker down on what's the blueprint of this exam. What do I need to know and how do I need to know?
That directs your key, right? The blueprint. And then watch this one. Let's say a scholar, though, really loves UWorld. They're like, I don't like that highlight thing in AMBOSS, but they're concerned about the detailed explanations in UWorld. Another scholar loves the detailed explanations because let's say they're a fast processor. They can read fast and they can comprehend fast. That's not a problem for them. But the scholar like me who reads slow, but I really like UWorld, there's still an option. UWorld has a summary note It's like 3 to 4 sentences that says the learning objective for this question was, and then they'll give you maybe 2 or 3 sentences versus the 4 or 5 paragraphs.
Yeah.
So this is why working with your academic advisor or learning specialist based on your learning preference can help you utilize a resource optimally.
Yeah.
And why right here, if you don't have access to that professional at your school, you can get it through FS.
Yes. And that's what I was going to say, because I just, I think that this is a very important thing to bring up with our scholars, because I don't think it was inherent for me as a medical student, but I lucked out because you was my mentor. So I just by nature had you to kind of guide me. But off GP, I don't think that I would be thinking of having a conversation with my academic advisor, as well, how do I approach selecting the right learning resource for me as the learner? And that can sometimes take a lot of deep connection between the student and the academic advisor. Yes. I don't know if that deep connection happens throughout the course of those first two, those first preclinical years that you have, with every, student and their academic advisor. So with that being said, it's very important to really understand who you are as a learner, to really get a mastery of that blueprint, because having that information gives you a little bit more information to bring into your meeting, or just bring it into a conversation with a mentee or an advisor, with a mentor or an advisor, about how you can select and go about navigating resources.
That's an important point, TJ. And for our pre-medical scholars, this is critical because you can cultivate that behavior right now. Even in your pre-medical coursework, you can be working with your faculty in this same sort of process. So when you get to medical school, you can seek it out through the faculty, you can seek it out through the medical education learning specialists. And I often hear, and we'll see this in our next season when we're working with resident physicians saying, where were you when I was in medical school?
Right.
Because the very behavior you just talked about was not cultivated. So it is part of our professional identity to also understand, how do we learn?
Yes. So that brings us to the check-in.
Yes.
Segment 4. So the readiness. So we talked about the wellness. I'm just doing a recap because I like to recap. Even when I'm talking to patients, I run my list. So we had the wellness structure. We had the blueprint and the mastery structure. You gave us some information about how to navigate, selecting resources. Now, I want you, DT, to give, myself and scholars information about, well, when do I assess, or how do I know when I'm ready to sit for step 1? What are the benchmarks that I need to be looking at in terms of my scores, practice exams? How many past practice exams do I need to take before saying I'm ready to take it? Just give us a little bit of information about that.
So your one true resource, I call it the predictive resource. If I were to take the step 1 exam today, this would be my score. You have, through your National Board of Medical Examiners testing portal, every scholar, medical student scholar, has a portal through which they register for the USMLE Step 1. And there's a self-testing portion of that portal. And these are commonly referred to as the NBME, standing for National Board of Medical Exam, but more specifically, they're called the Comprehensive Basic Science Self-Assessment. That's a long one, right? Comprehensive Basic Science Self-Assessment, or CBSSA.
So are these the same exams that the university is giving, that we talked about earlier for the comps?
They are. So let me break it out a little bit. So the Comprehensive Basic Science Self-Assessment is what the student can actually purchase through the self portal.
Yeah, the website.
These are retired step 1 questions. The Comprehensive Basic Science Exam, or CBSE, are also retired step 1 questions, but your university purchased those directly from the National Board of Medical Examiners. And they can request that exam to be customized based on the university's curriculum. So both of them are using retired step one questions. They're just organized a different way based on whether the student is purchasing it or the school is purchasing it.
But either way, you're what you're saying is that the one of those best predictive measures is NBME itself.
That's correct. Both of those exams, whether it's the CBSE or the CBSSA, they are the only reliable and valid predictors of step one performance. Meaning, when you take that assessment, it will tell you within a certain probability that you will pass this exam within a 1 week window. For example, on average, you need to score between 60 to 65% of the questions correct overall. Now, the lower end is 60%, that's low pass. The higher end is 65%, meaning that you will most likely pass. That's the range. Because remember, step one is pass fail. If you score, as an example, 65% of the questions correct, then it will say you have over a 90% probability, over 9% probability of passing the step one exam within 1 week of taking that practice assessment.
Okay.
If you're on the lower end, like 60% overall correct of the questions, right? It'll say your probability is only about maybe 50 to 60% that you'll pass the exam because you're on the lower end. So you're borderline pass, right? So the goal I always recommend for scholars is that when you're doing these practice, either the CBSE or the CBSSA, you're trying to score 70% overall correct of the questions, 70% of them correct. If you score 70% or better, 71, 72, 73, it doesn't matter. Once you're at 70%, it'll always say you have a 99% probability of passing step one within 1 week. It doesn't matter whether you score 85% of the questions overall correct. It'll still say 99% probability of passing. Because remember, it's pass fail.
Right.
So it's not about the higher percent correct beyond 70 I get, I'll do better on the exam. It's just that you're going to pass because it's step one, pass fail. So those are the predictors. So UWorld has practice exams, Form 1, Form 2. Kaplan has practice exams, Form 1, Form 2. Amboss has practice exams, Form 4, 2. Those are not predictive. Those are progress metrics. Progress meaning I'm making good progress toward my goal, but their algorithms for prediction are not valid and reliable because they're not done under standardized conditions.
So you mean to tell me that if I take UWorld Form 1, 2, or 3 and get the score and then run it through a Reddit calculator that can predict my score 1 week out, that's not reliable enough?
No, it's not reliable and valid.
Because that's what we do, because some of those you want to get the most predictive measure. So as you said, NBME, those are the actual exam scores.
That's correct.
Those are the actual exam questions. This is the people that are writing the test that you actually sit for.
Exactly.
But when it
they'll be giving them to hundreds of thousands of scholars.
Yes, but when it comes to like UWorld, yes,
or Kaplan or USMLE RX or Pass Test or Amboss,
those things,
right?
That you take these forms. Once you get the score, then we're trying to find out, like, okay, well, this said that I had a enter whatever three number score, but I know that this is not NBME questions.
Correct.
So I'm going to find a calculator online somewhere that somebody did, the C++ coding to, create this bot that would take your UWorld or, pass test, practice exam, or, any one that you may use to try to predict. And, I've never, felt comfortable going, using those predictive calculators that you just randomly find on the web to make your practice test
Correct.
more predictive. But
So this is how we use them. They have value. The way to look at any commercial question bank, UWorld, Past Test, USMLE RX, Kaplan, any one of the commercial question banks, look at those banks as progress metrics. That's what they're there for, to practice. Think about it. I want to get ready for the quote unquote most reliable and predictive assessment. So let me work with the ones that are designed to give me lots of practice. And let me work with the one, it gives me a simulation. Great. Let me simulate that. Let me practice that. Let me practice my wellness. Let me practice my thinking testing skills. Great. I got an 80%. That's great progress. Now, let me see if I were to do the most reliable and valid predictor, which is the CBSSA or the CBSE. Now I'm ready to do that. Let me see what I get on that. That's going to tell me now what the probability of pass is, right?
Yeah.
And so things have value, but we have to ascribe the most accurate and realistic perspective to that resource. And too often, that's not being done.
So we're closing out this episode, but we're not going to leave our scholars hanging.
That's right.
Because we know what you want. You want the questions. So when we come back for our bonus segment, we're going to dive into a few practice step 1 questions to demonstrate some tactics with, approaching a vignette, and going through the question, and then some explanations and how we can go through an error analysis in a good amount in an appropriate time, whereas though our scholars don't feel too overwhelmed.
That sounds good.
So
that sounds
we'll
good.
be back in a minute.
Bonus section.